Good evening and welcome once again. We are presently in our fourth installment, session 4, studying the logic of faith by Mattis Namgyel. I have to say that as I read this book, I'm getting increasingly impressed, and particularly this evening I'm praying that I can do justice to Elizabeth's absolutely brilliant presentation of, like I've said earlier, some very difficult themes in the presentation of Buddhism, which is obviously that what we're doing with Buddhism is essentially deprogramming. We're providing an insight that will take us out of, that we're going to arrive at what we call the middle way, or the view beyond view. But this also comes from a place of investigation. And with that investigation, not necessarily arriving at anything that we can hold on to, but that very insight that reality is such that we cannot hold on to it is a very important insight and gives way to a great degree of humanity, I guess we can call it, and something that Elizabeth refers to then as grace. And this process, us being proactive in this, is then what we are referring to as, well, we'll look at it now, faithing. But we've covered some very important points, which are the points of dependent arising, the conditional nature of phenomena, the possibility of the open inquiry, the willingness to look at our reality without having to freeze our reality. And also we've touched on the Buddhist perspective of, which is really the implication of dependent arising, emptiness, and also how emptiness plays out in terms of understanding emptiness, and yet also understanding the relative position from which we all operate, which is then called relative truth. So these are big topics, and I think we hopefully agree that we're very fortunate in having an extremely skillful presentation here. And also, this will be very useful for us because there is an enormous resource in the classical material that very often is rendered inaccessible due to differences in language and so on, cultural conditioning, etc., etc. And there are very often some stumbling blocks. So with this introduction, hopefully this will render the traditional material much more accessible, and it would be a shame not to draw on the traditional material because there is such an incredible wealth. So I see Elizabeth's book here as an extraordinary pioneering work in terms of establishing a language that engages with these key topics. I pledge allegiance to the experience of grace, the expression of human insight from which all authentic faith traditions have originated. I pledge allegiance to Mother Emptiness, Prajna Paramita, to the wisdom of the Buddha, and to the great spiritual genius Nagarjuna. First and foremost, I pledge allegiance to my beloved teacher, Dziga Kongtrul Rinpoche. So we're presently in chapter 3. It's on faith beyond belief and doubt. Faithing. And then a quote from the great Italian schoolman, Saint Bonaventura or Bonaventure. Take care that you don't reach conclusions so that you can understand the incomprehensible. When everything leans, the world cannot be known in a determinate or limited way. So in that everything is dependent arising, our attempts to establish the reality of the world from the point of view of its own side, its objective reality, is bound to fail. And so the way of engaging with the world is to engage in this open way of understanding the world, which then we could call faith. Faith is the gateway to knowing ourselves and the world. So Elizabeth says the term faith conveys a sense of confidence in the face of not knowing, a deep appreciation for mystery and wonder, and a longing to be touched by life, rather than withdrawing from or thinking you can fix it. And fix it here does not necessarily mean repair it, more sort of hold it or manipulate it. And this again comes referring then to the quote from Saint Bonaventure, where what we are wishing to do is understand the incomprehensible, right? So there, it's not going to work with our conclusion, which are with our rigid ways of fixing or holding the world. So what we've arrived at through looking at the previous sections, also with regards to the dependent nature of phenomena, that it leans, and also the empty nature of our perceptions, we can see that there is no objective truth to be known. We appreciate this with what we in Buddhism refer to as shunyata, that there's nothing to be grasped, that the nature is inconceivable. And that leads to something which is this humble curiosity about our world, which is beyond wanting to reduce it into data language. And that's where we enter this realm of awe and faith. Now, this is not stupid. This is rather a humble place that does not try to reduce things into boxes, but remains present with it. It's a highly intelligent situation. So it's a deep appreciation that seeks to be touched by the world as it is, without wanting to withdraw or wanting to label or change or improve it. Now, this doesn't mean that we become agnostic necessarily, in some sense of not wanting to try to engage with the world, but on the contrary, it's rather that we find a way in which we can operate with an engagement with the world on the terms of the things themselves, rather than our version of the things. Faith is then a way of engaging life. It is more like a verb, faithing. Elizabeth says, let's entertain faith, not as a truth, but as a practice or way of being. As reality is beyond our thoughts and language, we engage through faithing. She says, we have done a lot of looking and not finding, which has led to the insight that life, by virtue of its open dimensional nature, defies definition. To recognize and live in accord with this realization is to faith. Faith has a quality of giving over to something greater than the limited world of our beliefs and doubts. But it doesn't demand that you blindly give over agency to something outside of yourself. Far from it. Faithing is a playful exchange that it transpires between your own discernment and the world you experience. To say that the ultimate is not within the reach of the intellect does not mean that it cannot be known. It simply means that it exceeds beyond the power of ordinary thought and verbal expression. So this last sentence, this last quote, comes from the introduction to the Way of the Bodhisattva, Woolston Fletcher, and which is an extraordinary clear way of understanding, particularly then here Woolston is speaking about the wisdom chapter in the Way of the Bodhisattva, which deals with what we are looking at presently. So it's not about saying, with this, all this, you could say analysis, not being able to find anything and so on, this open dimensional nature, it's not about that there's nothing, but it is simply that it defies our ordinary thought and verbal expressions. That's all right. Of course, we in the modern world, we've become so impressed with ourselves and our ability to classify and categorize and define in terms of language and data and so forth. But we're looking at something greater, and that's then access through this humble position of faith. So faith, then again, it's not about some ability to have faith. It's not like open your heart and then the grace of the universe will grip you and all of a sudden you'll be transformed. It's something, it's a very ordinary thing. It's just a way of engaging in the phenomenal world with a wider perspective. So we have already established, as we've seen earlier, that there's nothing we can actually find or grip onto. Now this, by the way, in the Buddhist context, this is something that is always encouraged to not just be a formula that we learn, but it's something that it's a muscle that we continually train. It's called prajna, and we engage it through hearing about it, soaking ourselves in, you could say, the knowledge around it, the logic for it, if you like, the analysis that we've looked at so far. But then also, furthermore, it takes into the context a humble recognition of what is it that is difficult for us to access this personal process. That's what we call reflection. How is it this fits with what we're doing? And then once that begins to click, then to begin to engage a wider perspective around this is then meditation. So it's a whole path. So it's not that we sort of, oh yeah, in chapter 2, it told us we got nothing to hold on to. Yeah, sure. It did say that, and it showed us how. But it also is something that we need to continually work on. It's not about brainwashing ourselves, but it is about looking, and it's looking beyond the habitual ways that we classify things. So it takes work. But what we arrive at is then relinquishing these rigid positions, and that is what is the purpose with Nagarjuna's so-called middle way, and this is where we're going to arrive at today, hopefully. Now this is, by the way, this chapter is big, so let's see how far we get. The last session in this course here, actually, I wanted to bring in some classical references to connect with. So there's a little bit of margin. So I'm not going to push too hard to finish this chapter today. Let's see how we go. Anyway, the main thing is really that this makes sense. And by the way, whenever questions come up, please don't hesitate. Huh? But anyway, we are working towards this middle way, which is what we've already touched on, then a greater reality that's not bound by these limiting concepts. This and that, self and other. So faithing, and this is a sentence I've broken up. Faithing expresses the pursuit of grace in relationship with that which defies definition. So faith, as we know, very often has something to do with belief in God or belief in something greater. But there's also something that I remember, coming across the notion of faith. And like I remember thinking as a kid, I don't have this faith, but I have to say, those people who have it, good on them. Lucky people. But I used to think they were a bit naive. And so there was a reservation, a certain arrogance about it. There's something that didn't make sense. And that's then in relation with that, with defies definitions. See, that's where there was not really some proper reasoning that would convince me. So what we're looking at presently is that we can begin to see, probably humbly, that yes, our reality defies definitions. And the way to engage with that is then through this quality of engagement called faithing. And that does bring about this grace. And the grace is something that enables us to intuit, something humbly intuit, something which is extremely valuable, but it defies definitions. Kind of like with the human relationships, such as love or other qualities, where we have to say it's something you need to experience to properly understand it. We have a relationship between the truth in the object and the truth in us that recognizes and resonates. So there's something that we can say we experience in terms of awe and greatness and goodness, and it's greater than us. But at the same time, it's also because we have this potential inside ourselves that we can recognize it and that it does resonate with us. Elizabeth says, referring to the Buddha, he encouraged us to see the path as a moving and lively endeavor, not a truth or dogma to cling to. The path and our allegiance to it then become a living, dynamic experience. So we are looking at this dimension of awakening. And awakening as it exists is thankfully not something about dogma. It's not about data. It's about something where our mind opens. And that appreciation for this openness we have. And it's through the quality of trusting and faithing and that which opens us that we can engage this. I'm now drawing from something that I put up in the resources or reading folder, and it's a Chinese sutra. This is just the first few lines from it. It's called Xin Xin Ming, or the Faith Mind Sutra, and this is an English translation by somebody called Richard B. Clarke. It's something I've been familiar with for years, and I remember being introduced to this first from a friend of mine, and then also later from a friend of mine who was a French artist, who I knew and also knew his family, Robert Filiou, who worked on a translation into French on this. So it exists in French as well, and for sure other languages, but it's extraordinary, beautifully, very inspiring sutra. So that reads, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. Make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. If you wish to see the truth, then hold no opinions for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. When the deep meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail." So this, I thought, is very much along the lines of what we're looking at here. And if you look up there, there's actually a few things I put up that all are quite helpful. I think I mentioned the sutras, the Sutra of Dependent Arising, and also the rice seedling. Anyway, we've established this thing called Praticca Samutpada, not as a belief or a religious phenomenon as such, but just as something that we can observe. Phenomena, things are made up of, you know, they lean. Phenomena are dependent, conditional. So whatever we choose to call it, it's a fact. We could say water boils at 100 degrees, more or less. We can say that generally tables, they are equipped with legs, etc., etc. These are not particularly religious statements. We can verify. We cannot ultimately rely on the reductionist rational mind. So the mind that sort of operates with this way of just limiting things as it can be understood in terms of data, that we've understood is something that potentially is problematic. So the way that we reduce things is not a way that we actually will enable us to understand reality at all. Faith, however, Elizabeth says, faithing, on the other hand, offers us a place of rest and confidence, but it is a different kind of confidence, one founded on humility and openness. So we're not about all of a sudden saying now we're going to roll out a whole new doctrine or sort of the rightness of faithing, but it's more a way that we can engage with reality. She says, or rather, the point here being, faithing enables freedom from rightness and reification. It's protection from being stuck. Faithing enables us to handle life's difficulties and cut through the dualistic mind. So we can rely on ordinary, practical minds that deal with time and space, right? That's fine. That reductionist approach and rational approach is absolutely fine. But as far as goes as innate, ultimate reality, the nature of things, the contingent and conditional nature of mind, she's suggesting to abandon the mind that grasps in vain at what cannot be grasped. And that's where we have this intangible dimension of faith, as we also see in this Faith Sutra. And this enables us to engage with the world in a larger way. And that also takes us beyond the ordinary troubles of us refusing the nature of phenomena, the ever-changing nature of phenomena, all the difficulties that we have when we hold on to things in a particular way. And that's where we, engaging this, the mindset of the sage, it can cut through this limiting conceptual mind. So there's a lot to be said about this failing, but of course, we naturally have a way that we speak about faith. There's a discourse in place. And she says faith as a cultural narrative can be problematic. That is where we have this discourse around faith as disillusionment. Comes with disillusionment, deception, extremism, backward thinking, organized religion, emotional ties. All of these can be messy business. And that's where, if these are things in where, if we have invested faith in things that turn out to let us down, deceive us, tend to be based on what we don't regard as proper science. We might think of it as corrupt institutions, problematic engagements, and so forth, right? So that's where faith then can become something that, due to disappointment, we become cynical. So we need to distinguish between faith, as it's understood in this contemporary discourse, as an attempt, basically, to find lasting refuge in a moving world. And that's, of course, where we very often would have this cynical attitude. Well, don't trust anything, don't trust anybody, so on. I'm giving up on faith, which is because we can see and just have this sort of Nietzschean attitude. It's only the weak that need faith. It's only the weak that try to find something that can save them in this cruel, nasty reality. But the superhuman sort of discards that and accepts the fact that our world is dreadful. We're going to look at this sort of nihilist approach later, right? So that's where we want to propose faith as an alternative here, and that's where this distinction needs to be made, which is then what Elizabeth is proposing: the flexibility that embraces a diversity of ideas and experience, the flexibility that can see things from other perspectives and that humbly engages with the complexity of the world. So to accept things as they are to faith brings a deep sense of ease, insight, bravery, and compassion. You might even begin to wonder if you have any choice but to faith. So we're naturally at ease with regards to when we begin to let down the insecure practices that try to freeze phenomena, and opening up, then we begin to see far more. So it's as if this is the only real way of engaging with our life. We can begin to see that faith is something that is highly reliable. When we apply analysis, and that's what we've done earlier in terms of seeing the conditioned nature of our reality, see how it leans, see how we cannot find anything that actually exists, and also sees through these assumptions that language lead us to believe. When we begin to see through some of the assumptions that lie in the way that language constructs reality as being just in one way or another. So with analysis, we see through the assumptions that language leads us to believe. With analysis, we extract ourselves from ideas and open up for something greater. Faith then guides our well-being, wisdom, compassion. Faith is not synonymous with expectation, dogma, or rightness. Skeptics themselves operate with faith. Faith is what drives us into what is greater. Elizabeth says, as long as you're breathing and your heart is pumping in your chest, you'll never escape the need to faith. And why would you want to? The human predicament literally pushes at you day after day, calling to your courage and intelligence, imploring you to pay attention to life as it is, urging you to let go into humbleness. How long can you ignore it? So again, drawing on what we established in the previous chapter with analysis that deconstructs the superficial assumptions, then walking into this place in which faith is something that feels right, that is free from dogma, that is naturally insightful, naturally understanding the other, then faith is something that takes us out of a small place. And I think also this is where we understand. Maybe later there will be we have this this somewhere Elizabeth refers to what skepticism means in the old Greek, skeptikoi, which means to suspend judgment. Skepticism is, I think we'll look more at that later. And yes, no, her point here with skepticism is rather than when you have skeptics, they themselves, they might claim to be skeptics, but they still operate with a belief, and they still operate with their own set of metaphysics and so forth. So then belief, certainty on objectivist premises is difficult. And that's where we've seen this, again, the idea that we could have something that could be understood in terms of an actual objective reality of something that we observe. Very difficult. Yet it is this objective that leads to the notion of belief. So it is thinking that there is something that's really there. And that requires that we actually begin to restrict ourselves to just labeling things in a particular way. And with those labels, we then are not actually covering what it means to experience, to actually feel. Then again, and she's drawing on the scholarship of Karen Armstrong, she says the term belief has a complex history in terms of the way it was translated from Greek into Latin, and then drawing in the St. James translation of the German belieben, we then end up with the notion of belief. So there is a complex history, but what belief ends up meaning nowadays is to simply accept something without questioning. Right? People have the right to believe what they want, but that's also very often understood as something that's just profoundly stupid. But then again, we say, okay, you're willing to be stupid. That means you're not questioning, you're not analyzing, and then sure, you're right, you're allowed to believe things. And we very often also have these things where without actually having any kind of like idea, people just say, well, I choose to believe this. It's like, okay, but where is that situated? How is that substantiated? So when we stick to these labels, then with the map of belief, we miss out on the actual territory of experience. Elizabeth says, as we have explored throughout analytical investigation, when you hold on to beliefs as truth, they will never correspond to the full and dynamic nature of things. Beliefs are not hands-on or exploratory enough to allow for that. So the general sort of idea around belief is that it's something that operates where it's like unchallenged. So it's something that doesn't really come with inquiry. It's just, that's how it is. But if we begin to investigate things, then we begin to see that they don't really exist as something as narrow as those ways that we think of reality as solid. For example, and that's where she gives this very touching story about Dickie Wangmo's mother, who was watching this very primitively constructed narrative of Guru Padmasambhava's life with a funny sort of amateurish production. And had a profound impact on her, because she's not driven to this sort of notion of, well, that's not how it really would look like, like we've tried to be realistic, special effects have to be realistic. That's where it doesn't really matter, this sort of realism that we think is so real, how real is it anyway? And so the Tongsa Khyentse Rinpoche often praises actually the culture of India. Praises the culture of India where people are not bound by this sort of notion of reality in the same way. There's famously, you can find some places where Ganesh, who's the elephant god, rides on his mount, which is a rat. And Rinpoche will say, wonderful that we have India, in which you have this non-duality that's not bound by this conventional sense of what's possible and not possible. Yes, an elephant riding on a rat. Why not? So we can say that these sort of ways of holding on to reality can be narrow, and what we experience in life is something that goes beyond these sort of ideas of belief. So we have all these things that go beyond just narrow statements. Elizabeth speaks about exotic birds, jokes, a leaf dropping, heartbreak. Is these things that we can believe in? Are these things that are experienced in terms of belief or not belief? Life is not doesn't limit, is not naturally limited in that way. And then we have this initial discussion that somebody asked, well, do you believe in rebirth? And again, that's something that, because of the nature of the way that we tend to identify the science of reality around what can be objectified without looking at the subject, it's beyond the scope of the Western reductionist mechanistic understanding. And so something like rebirth, it draws on insight into something which is neither existent nor non-existent. And that's where the convention then is to speak of it in terms of what do you believe, rather than actually begin to look at what we have and actually see, hey, our reality goes beyond something that exists or not exists. For example, if we look at a self, then we would assume then, well, something about rebirth, I would presume that there is a self and there's a self that exists. But this self that exists, it's not something that exists within something that can be held as existing or not existing. So this consciousness that we experience, and not only consciousness, but the entire range of reality, it's something that goes beyond these limiting things, saying either there's something that exists, and we can't find consciousness like that, or non-exists, or we certainly can't say that it's non-existent. Actually, there's a quote that's attributed both to the third Karmapa and the great sage called Jigme Lingpa, which says, this mind, it's not something that even the Buddhas have seen. And yet, it's the basis for all of samsara and nirvana. So we say it's not existent because the Buddhas have never seen it. It's not non-existent because it's the basis of samsara and nirvana. So this reality that we have, it defies these limiting definitions of existence and non-existence. Of course, when people address this and the notion of death, then how it is being approached is through this fear of extinction. So of course we think, oh, this thing that I call life, and when I've seen others who have died, then they're no longer the way that they were before. Then there is this notion of extinction, that all of a sudden there's nothing more. So that's of course where it's coming from. But again, there's some presumptions here. And the reality is that we actually cannot find anything that actually has ever come into existence. And hence also there's nothing that really that really can be extinguished. Since there's nothing that was born, there's nothing that really ends also. And this is not about accepting some strange sounding mystical dogmas or whatever. It's about then approaching this with this open inquiry, that we actually begin to look at our experience. Elizabeth says, if you begin to look at reincarnation as an inquiry, it will transport you out of the restricted paradigm of is and is not. There's a little bit of an issue around the term reincarnation. Sometimes we would say rebirth, but anyway, we'll leave that discussion for another time. So we've looked here at the notion of belief, and now let's look at the notion of doubt. And Elizabeth draws then on a situation from her own retreat, where she sat down to meditate, and then all of a sudden, then it was, the inspiration was not there, and so that's where then the question comes up about what can we hold on to. And so she says the dry spell of doubt as a stepping stone, prompting inquiry. So that's how we would want to approach this. We have some doubt. It can be doubt in terms of our spiritual progression, but it can also be doubt in terms of any kind of assumption that we've had and then disappointed us. Actually, this is not where we should just stay with that, but we should actually have the courage to look at it. For example, somebody disappoints us. We had a belief in somebody, then it turns out to be more complex than that. Then we might have all of a sudden some doubt around this person. But if we keep pushing, this will bring us about to a place of understanding. And so this situation of doubt can push us to an unconditional faith. Elizabeth says, doubt and belief share the same bed. When our beliefs don't hold up, there is doubt. And when we fear meaninglessness, there is belief. There is something fragile about this whole system. So that's the problem with the idea of belief that is something that we are holding on to, because then we come along comes doubt. So either of these two as absolutes are problematic. Faith, on the other hand, explores doubt and belief equally. So this, of course, in Elizabeth's case as a practitioner in retreat, and also she draws on the example of Mother Teresa, is in the spiritual domain, but also in terms of just a regular secular situation. When we have faith, then we actually engage with, we don't necessarily operate from the point of view of just acceptance and in belief. And once we sort of encounter disappointment, if there's faith, we keep looking. And sometimes this takes us through to a greater understanding. So faith, on the other hand, explores doubt and belief equally. I hope this really opens up for the understanding of faith as something which is trusting in the nature of our reality. Of course, we all operate with that. Somehow seeing what, or trusting the nature, what there is. I'm thinking of there's this famous line from Chinlen Oberon in one of his works where he says, cows have faith in grass. And we have faith in a lot of the things that we operate with. It's basic to us that we just trust in our reality. I have faith in the bathroom. I operate with, my life is dependent on, the bathroom for certain things. And so nobody would ask me, do you believe in your bathroom? well, maybe I come down, the door is locked or whatever, then I would have doubt. But all of these doesn't detract from the general faith in the presence of the bathroom. It goes beyond doubt and belief. Now, what we have is that when we have doubt, it can, of course, be seen as something very helpful. We can see it as something that strips off self-deception. We can also have the unfortunate place where this doubt can become a dogma, and then that closes the door to a greater appreciation, a greater reality. We could very well, however, have the intelligent kind of doubt, which is this skeptikoi. What is it? Skeptikoi, yeah, which is suspending judgment, and that's what is intended with the original Greek notion of skepticism. Now we have a culture now where doubting is very much in vogue. In fact, faith is regarded, as we saw earlier. Elizabeth had a hard time marketing her talks on faith. Then she came up with the F word. But doubt, the God delusion, the sort of the notion of the end of faith, and so forth. We have this trending fascination with doubt. It reflects that we're intelligent, we're part of an analytical culture. But this also closes the door to a lot of investigation, and it can become a very arrogant place, and it can lead to rejecting this understanding of things that goes beyond this ordinary our ordinary ways of just of analysis. So this sort of culture of doubt can be very become very fundamentalist. You can have doubters that are very zealous. So so we can want to retreat from doubt. I'm not sure if I think it's more we want to retreat from faith, yeah? I don't want to know, I don't want to hear. Yeah, it's this sort of, it's the belief in nothing. You know how very often you will hear people, well, I don't believe in anything, or I believe in nothing. But that's actually cutting off, and that becomes a dogmatic position in itself. So, as Elizabeth says, ironically, unconditional protection can only come from faithing. We can have a lot of doubt in our world, and we can have been disappointed, and we can feel very insecure. But the thing is, we'll never really find security from retreating away from reality. The good news really is that opening up to reality is really something that is the only protection that we actually have. We can't find salvation from removing ourselves from reality. Rather, we can only find salvation from engaging with reality. And that's what's implicit in this humble inquiry and engaging with the universe that we call faithing. And that's where she quotes Anyan Rinpoche, a young Tibetan teacher in the US, who says we're doomed to enlightenment. That's the thing, we're stuck with our reality. There's only really one way of engaging with our world, and that is to look at it. And that's what we mean with then doomed for enlightenment, in the sense that this is what we have. So as far as these positions, belief as something which is just accepted without any kind of just a narrow way of accepting, or the rejecting of that doubt, we want to go beyond that. That's the implication here. Elizabeth says, as I move deeper, and then referring back to her experience of doubt when she was in retreat, as I moved deeper into my retreat, I began to see how clinging to notions of how my practice should look was no different from my modus operandi of just trying to survive in the world by getting what I wanted, living around unwanted experiences and trying to maintain some semblance of security in their midst. Meaning that approach to practice, that's just the usual thing. Wanting to have this inspiration to carry us in doing some spiritual thing, that's the usual. That's just, again, feeding into the same normal expectations around belief, in which then it's subject to doubt. She continues, there is a courage that comes from this insight because one no longer finds oneself at the mercy of one's preferences. The beauty and kindness of faithing is that it does not demand that you experience anything other than what you experience. It turns out that I didn't have to transcend my humanness to find genuine confidence. Rather, I came to see that my purpose as a spiritual practitioner was to increase my ability to be fully human. So, we're now going to look at two philosophical positions that assess things from the point of view of trying to assert some ultimate reality, and the one that says there cannot be any reality, hence there's nothing. And again, everything that we're doing here in terms of faithing, and so forth, is about going beyond these extremes. We've looked at belief and doubt, and now we're going to look at eternalism and nihilism. I'm going to be going a little bit over time. That's putting it mildly. I think I'm not even halfway through today's. But then again, that's okay. We have some margin, so. Please do ask questions. When there are no questions, I'm worried a little bit, and I'm thinking, gosh, maybe my explanation here is completely incomprehensible, and hence there's not even a place where to begin to ask. And the nature of these topics, they stand apart from how we've very often been, certainly from the popular discourse, and also from the way that we normally are educated, how we think about things. Then again, what we're talking about here, yes, it might be apart from the way that we've been educated, but it's not apart from the way that we undoubtedly have discovered is the way to navigate our world. So this, while there's a lot of, you could say, scientific or logical reasoning used here, which defies ordinary reasoning that we've come across, in terms of presenting the notion of faith, this very much is aligned with what we intuit. So the only difference here is that we're giving some, you could say, science or some logic to that which we intuitively appreciate. So this is good. So the view, quoting Nagarjuna, the view of dependent arising exposes all eternalistic and nihilistic views. And that's where the teachings of Nagarjuna, the middle way and so forth, they bring science to what we intuitively might know, but which very often is obscured by some dogmatic positions that we might subscribe to. These dogmatic positions are then what we call eternalistic and nihilistic views. Elizabeth says, human culture trends toward ontological beliefs, such as a divine presence of one or multiple gods, an unbreakable particle, or a primal energetic substance that serves as the building block for grosser matter, a spirit or universal self, or a consciousness that permeates all experience. So with ontological beliefs means something that we could say exists as absolute. Ontological inquiry, that's very important. That means to actually see what there is. But ontological beliefs is then essentially dogmas. And she says, if you look in a linear way for an answer to these questions, you'll get caught in a mode of infinite regress. You'll never get to the bottom of things or reach some final conclusion. So this is something where we, with this pursuit of ontological belief, we expect to eventually arrive at some sense of knowledge, some solid ground. That's of course what we do as humans, as philosophers, as scientists, and so forth. We'd like to assert things. Does it exist or doesn't it exist? We don't operate outside of these two, what we in Buddhism call extremes. Unfortunately, for the insecure subject seeking such manageable information, then reality does not let itself be pigeonholed in this way. So that's the thing. When we have a science that would assert existence or non-existence, it actually ends up not talking about the actual human experience. And so that's at the end of the day, you have the scientists that go home, and what they're doing in their laboratory has little to do with what they are as humans. So when we have children asking, Mom, why is the sky so blue? Where does it all come from? All of these, they actually come from a natural urge to understand. But when we then limit them into, giving a very scientific explanation of why the blueness comes from the way that light breaks as it comes through the atmosphere and so on, we're actually still not really getting at a real answer of things, because we can keep going further and further. We might give an answer that then they go, oh, and then that's kind of supposed to be it. But you could keep going further and further, and you come into this infinite regress where you actually, the more you look at the actual causes, the more and more complex it comes, and you don't really come up with an answer. You just come up with some data. She says, your questions themselves, the notions of blue, why, and the sky, where it comes from, they come from language agreements that only have meaning in the context of human sensibilities. These words and ideas are not truths unto themselves, but frameworks through which you can evaluate and explore things. They are part of your investigation, and when coupled with deep interest, they can open up your world like fractals into a great nature of contingency. You will emerge as if from a narrow tunnel into a perspective unhindered by the limiting concept of a linear singular source of causation. So if we're willing to dispense with the expectation that we could find some, if we're the limiting, you could say, agreements just that we operate with when we say, this is the explanation. This is the explanation only from the point of view of establishing a scientific language. And that functions fine for operating within its own particular parameter. But at the same time, we could continue this investigation and go far beyond that into then seeing the world in all its complexity. And that's where we then begin to have this awe, this openness that then she speaks about in terms of faithing, that goes beyond just this data. And that's where we're not sitting there with formulae and information, but we're actually beginning to really, the real scientist is then outside of the laboratory, engaging with life and our experience with life. Now, as we particularly saw in chapter 2, investigating things, we cannot find anything absolute. We have tried, right? Everything is made up of things that are again made up, and we come up with this web of contingency, this web of things that are conditional. We have functioning things, but something absolute we cannot find. All right. Now presently we're in the section on eternalism, right? And that's where we might think that, okay, there must be something. Okay, well, okay, but drawing on what we have studied earlier, then let's assume there was something absolute. Huh? Okay, Elizabeth then says, and this is very, this is, better get used to this. This comes up a lot in middle way reasoning. If there was something absolute, it would have to be singular, unchanging, and completely independent. And we've already seen that that's an impossibility. To be eternal, it would have to be without a beginning or an end. So would it really be something existent? It couldn't have any connections or causes and conditions. It would have to be entirely unconditional, above everything else. It would have to be partless. It would have to be something that if we looked at it, it would never be seen as being made up in any way. It would have an absolute nature that we call it resists analysis. It would be unaffected by movement and mutual causality. It wouldn't stand in relationship to anything, and it's not something that would ever change. Now, this is not something that you have to take psychotropics to appreciate, or that it's that difficult. It's just that we could actually see that, yes, it just doesn't make sense to believe in this absolute. I think intuitively most people understand things are conditional, but if it were that we pursued this culture of investigation, assuming that something existed absolutely, okay, then we have to use this kind of language. Then we have to use this kind of methodology. You know, so that's where also we come down to. Actually, she's saying, as per Carl Sagan, who said, you know, if what is it again? You cannot make a pie from scratch. You have to make a whole universe. The universe itself also cannot be made from scratch. Now, Elizabeth, she describes how that her commitment is to the purity of the Buddhist view and to wisdom in general. And also, like she says later on, the wisdom traditions, they initially have this understanding that defies this objectification. But of course, it happens then that things are put into boxes and systems and so forth. And that also happens in Buddhism. So everywhere, there's a need to restate and clarify this nature of wisdom. So we need to appreciate this dimension of wisdom that exists before dogma or systems of belief diminish it. And so, of course, this inevitably happens because it's human nature to wish to try to establish something as absolute. The problem here is not really that we have any problem, it's more that we have this wish to find something absolute, and it doesn't exist. Or we could say, yeah, it has yet to be found, or rather we could also say it's impossible to find it. Yeah? And the remedy here, what we're talking about, is that we understand that things exist in terms of relationship. So, so we simply need to, this is the point with the Praticca Samutpada, we're actually engaging reality, not dogma. And the way that we engage reality, like we said last time, it's about actually looking. And the way that we look, well, that needs training. That's why there's a path. Now this, so the very idea then, let's just see here. See if my notes are lining up with my. Did I just skip something here? Yeah, I did. No, sorry. Yeah, good. In the traditional Praticca Samutpada, the texts describe the genesis of our confusion as coming from our inability to bear the fullness of the nature of infinite contingency, that things cannot be reduced to some thing. This misunderstanding gives true a platform. So once we have this misunderstanding, right, true serves as a terra firma for belief. Belief supports rightness, and from there generates a cycle of fundamentalism, fear, and confusion. This is if this is really profound. If we can understand this, this is where we can understand how samsara comes about. This, and also the innocence of samsara. We somehow shrink away from understanding the vastness of what there is and who we are into some insecurity, and from then confusion begins to build these ideas. Now, once we understand that this inability to bear the fullness, sorry, it says fooliness. Then we understand where fundamentalism comes from. Fundamentalism is something that's, you can understand as a human condition. Fundamentalism naturally operates in the insecurity that looks for true existence, something to hold on to. It brings along then its own aggression, this insecurity that wishes to uphold something as true hinders communication. Understanding dependent arising remedies this. The humility of faith serves as a refuge from the confusion of fundamentalism. Hopefully that makes sense. Fundamentalism is antithetical to genuine Buddhist practice. So if you're a good Buddhist practitioner, hopefully, rather, if we suffer from fundamentalism, the Buddhist path is supposed to be the remedy. But of course, what happens is also in Buddhism, as we saw earlier, as in other wisdom traditions, is that there are practices that then become ritualized and become accepted as beliefs without necessarily serving their purpose, which is to dismantle fundamentalisms. So that happens. So when we begin to look into dependent arising, it's important that we understand dependent arising is not religion. It is deeply human practice. If we think of this as a set of rules, we miss the point. Like the monks who had heart attacks. There is this famous Heart Sutra that's been talked a lot about recently. And in there, the Buddha says there is no form, there is no, we say there is no form, there is, well, we talk about, there is, what is it again? We talk about all how the skandhas, don't exist, how the ayatanas don't exist, and so forth. And we say there is no eye, there is no ear, and so forth. A lot of negations are basically with regards to all the range of phenomena. And that is essentially to relieve us of this fundamentalist attitudes. But some of the early practitioners who had taken wisdom and the wisdom of the Buddha as something dogma, this upset them so profoundly that they had heart attacks. That's what we hear. Thomas Rinpoche just says they would have had to be quite sophisticated, actually, because some of us who hear these things like there is nothing inherently existing, we're kind of just like, oh yeah, okay. But that's one way of seeing it. But of course, what Elizabeth's point is here is that we want to remain free from dogmatism around these, what we're saying when we're approaching dependent arising. Also, what we're saying here is not some absolute sense of truthfulness. When we understand dependent arising, it's just that there's a web of conditioning. And this is actually where the sutra, the rice seedling, is very, very profound. In the Monday programs in August, I actually want to go through the rice seedling sutra. And in there, it's not as if there's some intention behind it. It's not like the rice seed has a particular agenda, from becoming rice seed to becoming a rice plant. So there's a quote from there. The seed does not think, I form the sprout, nor does the sprout think, I am formed by the rice seed. There's no intention behind this. This is just how things operate. They're just naturally arising. Effects arise out of causes. So she says, what is so beautiful about Pratitya Samuppada is that while you can't locate a singular eternal thing, and therefore it follows that no idea, belief, or ideology could possibly be eternally true, such an insight does not deny the existence of the God you pray to, nor does it dismiss scientific discovery, the blueness of the sky, or the sacredness or power of any particular tradition. The world of relationship is powerful and effective despite its illusory nature. To live freely in the nature of interdependent expression, you don't have to give up the world you experience. All you have to give up is clinging to truth. Actually, I think that's a good place to stop today, to just bring around, this actually recaps what we are working with. It's not about the greatness of our reality or around the details of what we experience and so forth. It's not in any way about stopping what we experience, but what we are relinquishing is our insecure attempts to reduce our experience. And that's where we sometimes reduce experience by slotting them into these labels of truth that then end up becoming objects of either belief or doubt. All right. So I hope this makes sense. Are there any questions? Yeah. Thank you, Jakob. Did you put anything in the Dropbox after the last session? Haven't found anything. I have. And I'd like to say that there is a problem with Dropbox because sometimes, not with Dropbox as such, but with the individual browser, that sometimes in the cache, it keeps an impression of what was, how a browser operates is that you go to websites, and then very often, just to make it quicker, the browser has what's called a cache. It's a memory of what it used to look like, and that sometimes it thinks this is how it looked like, and it doesn't actually refresh what the website itself contains. So we've looked into this, and there's somebody who very kindly did some research. So I've put up in the reading folder, I've put a link to a place where it can explain how to deal with this. But essentially, it's a question of the browser just needing to refresh its cache. So the recording is up there. Yeah. Sometimes when I put these recordings up, usually I try to do it pretty much straight after the session, but yeah, sometimes it might, if I forget or something, it could be a little longer, but it usually gets there. I try to get them up within the next 12 hours or so. Sometimes it's a bit late at night here, but then certainly next morning I'll get onto it. Okay. Okay. Let's see here. All right. I'm just going to skip down to the dedication at the end. So by the way, so next time, simply just read the rest of this chapter, and also the next few chapters. So normally the homework for next time would have been to read the rest of the book, but we'll also be looking at the rest of this particular chapter. Yeah, thank you. By this positive action may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas, which arise from merit and wisdom. Thank you.